Welcome to Drum Talk. So we're going to talk about some of my influences, and I'm going to call this 70s studio drummer influences. And we're going to start with Hal Blaine, which we talked a little bit about in the Concert Tom video, and we're going to move on past Hal Blaine. Now, so I guess it's really starting in the 60s. Hal Blaine was the session drummer of the 60s in LA, but there was a couple other guys who were great session drummers in the 60s. The guy who also did sessions in LA that did a lot of sessions was Earl Palmer. And Earl Palmer played with, I believe he played with Fats Domino. I know he played with the Righteous Brothers. He played on a lot of albums. He played on a lot of the same albums that Hal was playing on. They were trading off back and forth a lot, okay? And of course you have your Motown drummers, your Benny Benjamins, and Uriel, I can't remember his last name, but there's the Motown guys. And then of course you had your New York session drummers like Gary Chester and others in New York in the 60s. But by the 70s, you had the next level, the next crop of studio. It was Uriel Jones, by the way. The next level of studio musician came up. And the first guy that comes to mind from that late 60s got into the studio thing in LA was Jim Gordon. Now Jim Gordon is an interesting guy, and I recommend you go on Wikipedia and you find out his tragic story, because he had a tragic story about 1982 or 83, I believe it was. He was a schizophrenic, and nobody diagnosed him properly, and he wasn't on the proper meds, and he ended up killing his mother. And he was hearing voices and stuff, and he's in prison today. But he was an amazing drummer. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, he played with people like Delaney and Bonnie. He wrote Eric Clapton's Layla, okay? He went on tour with people like Jackson Browne and many other LA-based rock acts of that era, okay? He played on a lot of albums, a lot of different stuff. And Jim Gordon was an amazing drummer. He had an incredible time, and he was brought up by Hal Blaine and Earl Palmer. So Jim Gordon, and the other Jim from that era, was Jim Keltner. And Jim Keltner played with the Traveling Wilburys. He's played with most of the Beatles. He played with Ringo, he played with John Lennon, he played with George Harrison. I think the only Beatle he didn't play with was Paul McCartney, as far as officially on a record. But he probably played with him somewhere else. But Jim Keltner is an amazing drummer, and I love Jim Keltner to pieces. I'm going to do a cover of a Jim Keltner cover playing a Bob Dylan song during Bob Dylan's Christian era in the early 1980s. Jim played on those albums. But Jim's an amazing drummer, okay? And another guy from that same era would be Russ Kunkel. He was coming up too, and Russ Kunkel became the drummer of James Taylor and eventually went on to play with Linda Ronstadt and Jackson Browne and, oh my gosh, Stevie Nicks, everybody. He's another guy that came right out of that LA studio thing. And it was just at the right place at the right time. Simple drummers. All these guys have the same thing, is that they have great time, they played simply, and they played for the song. But each one was unique. Jim Gordon was a time monster, and he was creative. One of Jim's most creative tracks was Pretzel Logic. He was on the album Pretzel Logic by Steely Dan, and he played on the song Ricky Don't Lose That Number. It's just a beautiful, beautiful track to listen to. Okay? I'm going to be doing a Jim Gordon song in the future. It may come out before this comes out. I'm not sure which is going to go first. But it's a song by a CCM act, a contemporary Christian music act of the early 70s, when CCM was, nobody knew what it was. It was just a bunch of folk Christian rock artists. And it was a band called the Second Chapter of Acts. And Jim Gordon played on that first album of the Second Chapter of Acts. And he did some amazing drumming on those albums. Now, the 70s, they were all doing the Hal Blaine thing. So when you listen to a lot of these tracks from those days, you've got dead concert toms, okay? Or you've got double-headed toms, dead and down. Or you got deep snare drums, dead and down, that LA snare drum sound, that bzz sound, okay? And Jim Gordon was no exception to that. He played a lot of those kinds of sounds. But he was an amazing drummer. And of course his work with Delaney and Bonnie and Eric Clapton is legendary. I mean, legendary to be listening to Jim Gordon. He wrote Layla. He wrote the whole piano thing. He was a piano player too. Amazing drummer and piano player musician. Russ Kunkel still to this day is one of those guys I love to hear play. And I know Russ has moved to Nashville area and he's been there for quite some time now. Lyle Lovett is who he goes out with. But every once in a while you'll catch him with James Taylor or Jackson Brown or one of those guys. Every once in a while you'll catch him going back and doing something. A couple other guys from that era that were great drummers that don't get noticed. The drummer Ed Greene. Ed Greene was another name from that era. He played on Steely Dan's Asia album, but I know he played on a couple other Steely Dan albums too, probably. I believe he was on the cut. Oh man, he wasn't on Home at Last. I think Home at Last was Bernard Purdy. But anyhow, Ed Greene, amazing drummer. All these guys, same thing in common. They've got rock solid time and creativity. So anyhow, this is my shout out to some of these influences. I'm going to be doing some covers where their covers specifically going to be Russ Kunkel or specifically Jim Keltner or specifically Jim Gordon. And I just wanted you guys to hear the name. But it all comes from that same era of drumming called the 70s Los Angeles Session Guys. And these were the precursor to Jeff Porcaro. Matter of fact, Jeff Porcaro would say that Jim Keltner was the guy that made him want to be a session drummer. Jim was his hero. Jeff used to dress with a vest. He used to put on a vest just like Jim Keltner used to wear all the time. That was Jeff's thing, to copy that. So anyhow, this is a little shout out video, a little influence video about Jim Gordon, Jim Keltner, Russ Kunkel, Ed Greene, and I'm sure I'm going to be adding to it because I've got a whole bunch of guys that are influences. But the reason why these studio guys are influences to me is incredible time, incredible creativity. And let me say something about my drum covers, okay, just for a second. I hope this makes the time. When I'm doing a drum cover, it's more than playing note for note. I try to get note for note when I can, and I try to get the fills when I can, especially when I'm syncing up with a track. The Jim Gordon cover I'm doing, I'm trying to sync up with his track. And it's hard to lay on Jim Gordon's drums because he did some really outside stuff. These fills were a little outside, and it wasn't with clicks. It was all about the feel of these guys. These guys brought a certain feel to a session. So when I'm playing a drum cover, I'm trying to get into the feeling, the vibe of those drummers. Okay, I'm trying to lay it down in such a way that it sounds like they would play it in their phrasing, in the way they phrase the toms, the way they hit the cymbals, the way they play the hi-hat phrases. And I may not get every single one, but I'm trying to emulate them to some extent because that's had an influence on my playing. We all learn by who we're influenced by. Okay? So who influences you is going to influence your drumming as a whole drumming as a drummer. And eventually, over years and years of time, okay, you're not a clone of that person. You become your own self, which has those influences. So in my playing, Jeff Porcaro comes out, Danny Serafin comes out, Steve Gadd comes out, Russ Kunkel comes out, Jim Gordon comes out. It comes out in little ways. You wouldn't say, well, that's a Jim Gordon, or that's a Russ Kunkel, or that's a Jim Keltner. But you can feel it in the way I'm doing some of my things, the way I play things, the way I play feel. So when I'm doing a drum cover, I'm always trying to get it into the vibe of these drummers. One other 70s drummer, Bill Maxwell. I hope he gets on here too. If he does, I have to come back and do one on Bill Maxwell. Bill Maxwell was the king of contemporary Christian music in the 70s and early 80s. He played with Andre Crouch. I heard him with Keith Greene, then heard Andre Crouch. He wrote TV music, a lot of TV music. He was doing the show with Urkel. I forget what the name of that show was. But he was the writer, the music writer for that television show. And Bill Maxwell's played with tons of guys. And Bill Maxwell had a certain style of playing hi-hat that I always liked. His hi-hat thing was he always was kind of accenting and pushing on it a little bit, trying to push in little opens and closes. Amazing drummers to listen to. I can't say that some of my hi-hat style doesn't come from Bill Maxwell. Anyhow, he was also the drummer of Koinonia, in case you're in the fusion. Koinonia was the band that had Alex Acuna in it too. Alex Acuna is another guy. Anyhow, I wanted to do a shout out to Jim Gordon, that's why I did this. Guys, have a great day. This is Christmas Eve, but this is going to come out after Christmas. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.